Elena Cross stood in her father's marble penthouse, blood trickling from her split lip, listening to him negotiate her price. She wasn't being rescued. She wasn't being protected. She was being sold. Payment for a debt her father owed to the most dangerous man in the city. Victor Hale didn't deal in mercy. He dealt in ownership. And tonight, Elena became his property. If you want to know how a woman traded like currency becomes the queen who can't be bought, stay until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Elena's story travels. Quote, the penthouse smelled like expensive cigars and older regrets. Elena Cross had learned long ago not to breathe too deeply in her father's presence. Every inhale felt like swallowing broken glass, sharp reminders of all the ways she'd never been enough. She stood now in the center of his private study, arms wrapped protectively around her middle, trying to make herself smaller. It was a skill she'd perfected over 26 years. Disappear. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't take up space you haven't earned. Her father, Richard Cross, stood with his back to her, staring out floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline he'd spent 3 decades conquering. His reflection in the glass looked carved from stone, jaw tight, shoulders rigid, every line of his body broadcasting the contempt he'd never bothered hiding. You've always been a disappointment, Richard said, his voice flat and factual, like he was reading stock reports. Your mother knew it before she left. I've known it since you were 12 and started eating your feelings instead of controlling them. Elena flinched. The familiar shame crawled up her spine, hot and choking. She'd heard variations of this speech her entire adult life. Too heavy, too soft, too visible in all the wrong ways. Her father had built an empire on image, sleek, powerful, untouchable, and she was the flaw in his perfect facade, the daughter he introduced at family functions with apologetic explanations and rapid subject changes. I've spent a fortune keeping you hidden, Richard continued, still not turning around. Private schools where you wouldn't embarrass me. That apartment in Brooklyn where none of my colleagues would see you. Even paid for those ridiculous online classes you take pretending you'll finish a degree you started 6 years ago. Each word landed like a physical blow. Elena dug her fingernails into her palms, focusing on that small pain to distract from the larger one blooming in her chest. But despite my best efforts to minimize the damage you caused simply by existing, Richard said, finally turning to face her, you've somehow managed to become useful. Something cold slithered through Elena's stomach. Her father never called her useful. He called her expensive, embarrassing, exhausting, but never useful. I don't understand, she whispered. Of course you don't. Richard crossed to his desk, pulling a crystal decanter toward him and pouring 3 fingers of scotch. Understanding requires intelligence you've never demonstrated. So let me explain it simply. I made a mistake, a significant one, and you're going to fix it. Elena's hands trembled. What kind of mistake? Richard took a long drink, his eyes cold and calculating over the rim of his glass. The kind that costs $7 million and involves people who don't accept excuses or payment plans. The kind that requires immediate resolution, or I lose everything I've built. I don't have $7 million, Elena said, her voice cracking. I don't have anything. You made sure of that. Exactly. Richard smiled, and it was the cruelest expression Elena had ever seen on his face. Which is why you're perfect for this particular transaction. Victor Hale doesn't want my money. He wants something more valuable, something I own that he can take as payment for my betrayal. The room tilted. Elena grabbed the back of a leather chair to steady herself. Victor Hale, the most dangerous man in New York, Richard finished. Yes, I made the catastrophic error of attempting to deceive him in a business arrangement. He discovered my deception, as men like Victor always do, and now he's demanding restitution. What does this have to do with me? Richard set down his glass with deliberate precision. Victor doesn't want money. He wants leverage, control, a living reminder that I'm beneath him, that I owe him, that he can take anything he wants from me whenever he chooses. Elena's breath came faster, shorter. No, you can't. I already did. Richard pulled a document from his desk drawer, sliding it across the polished mahogany surface. The contract was signed this afternoon. As of 8 o'clock tonight, you belong to Victor Hale, completely, Legally, irrevocably. The words on the page blurred as Elena stared at them, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Transfer of custody, binding agreement, no legal recourse. You sold me, she breathed. You actually sold me. I resolved a debt using available assets, Richard corrected, as if the distinction mattered. You should be grateful. For the first time in your miserable existence, you're serving a purpose beyond draining my resources. Elena looked up at her father, really looked at him, and saw the truth she'd been avoiding her entire life. He felt nothing for her, not disappointment tinged with love, not frustration mixed with hope. Nothing. She was furniture to him, property, a problem finally solved. I won't go, she said, but even to her own ears the words sounded hollow. Where would she run? She had no money, no friends her father hadn't systematically isolated her from, no skills beyond the half-finished education he'd mentioned so dismissively. You don't have a choice. Richard checked his watch. Victor's men arrive in 20 minutes. I suggest you don't make this more difficult than necessary. He has a reputation for creative solutions to resistance, and I'd prefer not to have your blood on my carpets. The casual cruelty of it, the complete absence of anything resembling paternal concern, finally broke something fundamental inside Elena. The part of her that had spent 26 years trying to earn his love, his approval, his basic acknowledgement of her humanity. You're a monster, she whispered. I'm a businessman, Richard replied. And business requires difficult decisions. Victor Hale wanted something that would hurt me to give. You're that thing. Congratulations on finally mattering. Before Elena could respond, the study door opened. Marcus, her father's head of security, stepped inside with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. They're here, sir, Marcus said quietly. Downstairs, waiting. Richard nodded. Bring them up. Let's complete this transaction before I change my mind and decide my daughter's marginal value doesn't outweigh the satisfaction of watching Victor Hale wait. Marcus hesitated, his eyes flickering to Elena with something that might have been sympathy. Then he disappeared, leaving her alone with the man who'd just traded her like livestock. For what it's worth, Richard said, returning to his window and his skyline, Victor Hale is known for taking excellent care of his possessions. As long as you're obedient and don't cause problems, you'll probably live quite comfortably. Elena wanted to scream, to rage, to grab the crystal decanter and shatter it against her father's skull. But 26 years of conditioning held her frozen, small, silent. The study door opened again. 3 men entered, and Elena's entire understanding of danger fundamentally reorganized itself. The first 2 were clearly security, massive, scarred, moving with the fluid awareness of predators scanning for threats. But the third man, the one who walked between them like violence incarnate, made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Victor Hale was nothing like she'd imagined. The newspapers called him brutal, ruthless, a criminal emperor who controlled half the city's underground economy. They printed grainy surveillance photos showing a shadowy figure leaving crime scenes. They speculated about his methods, his reach, his complete imperviousness to law enforcement. None of those descriptions had prepared her for the reality of him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored black suit. Dark hair swept back from a face that looked carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard edges. But it was his eyes that stopped Elena's heart. Pale gray, cold as winter steel, scanning the room with predatory precision before settling on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. Victor Hale looked at her the way most people looked at valuable things they were considering purchasing. Thorough, assessing, completely devoid of mercy. Richard, Victor said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through Elena's chest. I appreciate your punctuality. I appreciate your discretion in this matter, Richard replied, his tone careful, respectful in a way he'd never used with his daughter. I trust the contract meets your specifications. It does. Victor's gaze never left Elena. Though I prefer to inspect merchandise before finalizing acquisitions. The word merchandise sent ice through Elena's veins. She wasn't a person to these men. She was a thing, an object changing owners. Victor crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping directly in front of her. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, radiating heat and danger and something Elena couldn't name but felt in every nerve ending. "Look at me," he commanded. Elena's eyes had dropped to the floor automatically, another survival instinct from years of making herself invisible. Now she forced herself to meet Victor's stare, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. For a long moment, Victor studied her face with clinical detachment. Then his hand came up, fingers gripping her chin with firm but not painful pressure, tilting her head to examine her from different angles. "She's terrified," Victor observed, still holding Elena's face steady. "She's dramatic," Richard dismissed. "Always has been. Give her a few days and she'll settle into whatever role you require." Victor's eyes narrowed fractionally. "There's a bruise forming on her cheekbone. Recent." Silence crashed through the room. Elena felt her father's panic before she heard it in his voice. "A misunderstanding," Richard said quickly. "She was resistant to the arrangement. I may have been too forceful in my explanation." Victor's thumb brushed across the tender spot on Elena's face, and she couldn't stop the small flinch that followed. Something flickered in those cold gray eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You hit her," Victor said flatly. "I corrected her," Richard countered. "Which is my right as her father until the contract transfers ownership." Victor released Elena's chin and turned to face Richard Cross with such sudden violence that both security guards tensed. "Your rights ended the moment you signed that contract. She became mine at 8 o'clock. That was 17 minutes ago, which means you just struck my property without permission." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Richard's face went pale. "Victor, I didn't mean... You raised your hand to something that belongs to me." Victor's voice was soft, deadly. "Explain why I shouldn't break every bone in that hand as a reminder of boundaries you clearly don't understand." Elena watched her father crumble. The powerful man who'd terrorized her entire life, reduced to stammering apologies and desperate explanations. And Victor Hale didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Richard Cross like a wolf deciding whether prey was worth the effort of killing. "It won't happen again," Richard finally managed. "I swear it. I apologize for overstepping. She's yours. Completely. I won't touch her, won't contact her, won't interfere with whatever arrangements you choose to make." Victor let the silence stretch until even Elena felt suffocated by it. Then he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Get your things," he said. "Whatever matters to you. You have 5 minutes." Elena's mind went blank. "My things?" "Personal belongings, clothes, photographs, items of sentimental value." Victor checked his watch, a gesture so similar to her father's it made her stomach turn. 4 minutes and 40 seconds now. "I don't..." Elena's voice cracked. "I don't live here. My apartment is in Brooklyn. Everything I own is there." "Address," Victor said simply. She gave it, and he nodded to one of his security guards, who immediately pulled out a phone and began speaking in rapid, clipped sentences. Apparently her entire life was being packed up and transported while she stood here trying to understand how her world had collapsed so completely in the space of an hour. "The contract," Richard said weakly. "We should finalize..." "The contract is finalized," Victor interrupted. "I'll have my lawyers deliver your copy tomorrow. Tonight, I'm taking what's mine and leaving before I give in to the temptation to throw you through that window you're so fond of staring out." He placed a hand on the small of Elena's back, possessive, controlling, but somehow less violating than any of her father's touches had ever been, and guided her toward the door. "Wait!" Richard called out. "Elena, "No," Victor said, not even turning around. "You don't get last words. You lost that privilege when you traded her like currency. She's done with you, permanently." Elena walked through her father's penthouse for the last time, Victor's hand steady against her spine, 2 massive security guards flanking them like an honor guard, or a prison escort, she wasn't sure which. The elevator ride down 43 floors happened in complete silence. Elena stared at her reflection in the polished brass doors, a woman who looked hollowed out, wearing a dress her father had chosen because it hid the body. He found shameful, her face pale except for the darkening bruise on her cheekbone. She looked like a ghost, a shadow, someone who'd already disappeared. The lobby was empty except for Victor's people. 6 more security personnel positioned at strategic points,
wearing suits that didn't quite hide the weapons beneath. They fell into formation as Victor walked Elena through the marble expanse, and she realized dimly that this was a military operation. Coordinated, professional, overwhelming. Outside, 3 black SUVs idled at the curb. Victor opened the rear door of the middle vehicle himself, waiting while Elena climbed inside with as much dignity as she could manage. He slid in beside her, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and something darker, more primal. The door closed.
The vehicle pulled smoothly into traffic, and Elena Cross realized she had no idea where she was going or what would happen when she got there. "You're shaking," Victor observed. Elena looked down at her hands, clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She was shaking, her entire body trembling with shock and fear and the awful, crushing weight of her father's final betrayal. "I'm scared," she whispered, because what was the point of lying to a man who now owned her? "Good," Victor replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "Fear keeps you alert. Alert keeps you alive. In my world, those instincts will serve you well." Elena forced herself to look at him. In the dim interior of the SUV, Victor's face was all sharp shadows and harder angles, his eyes reflecting passing streetlights like a predator's. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you come home with me," Victor said. "You'll be given a room, security clearance, and very specific instructions about boundaries and expectations. You'll follow those instructions exactly, and in return, I'll give you something your father never did." "What's that?" Victor's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze shifted, became almost human for a fraction of a second. "Protection. No one touches you without my permission. No one hurts you without answering to me. And no one, not your father, not his associates, not anyone in this city, gets to treat you like you're worthless." Tears burned behind Elena's eyes. She refused to let them fall. "Why? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Victor replied. "I know Richard Cross is a coward who raised his hand to his own daughter because she represented a problem he couldn't solve. I know you've been hidden away and diminished until you forgot you could take up space. And I know that in my home, under my protection, you will never be invisible again." The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, cracked something open in Elena's chest. This terrifying man who'd purchased her like property was promising her visibility, acknowledgement, safety. She didn't know whether to believe him, but sitting in her father's penthouse, listening to him calculate her worth in dollars and debts, she'd felt something inside her die. Maybe it didn't matter whether Victor Hale's promises were real. Maybe anything was better than the slow suffocation of being Richard Cross's greatest disappointment. "I don't know how to do this," Elena admitted. "Be someone's property. Live in your world. I don't know what you expect from me." "Tonight, I expect you to breathe," Victor said. "Tomorrow, we'll discuss expectations. But right now, just focus on the fact that you survived your father's worst betrayal. That takes strength most people don't have." Elena didn't feel strong. She felt shattered. But Victor Hale looked at her like he could see something beyond the broken pieces. And for the first time in her life, someone's gaze didn't feel like judgment. The SUV turned onto a private drive lined with iron gates and security checkpoints. Beyond them, an estate sprawled across what must have been acres of prime real estate, the main house lit like something from a dark fairy tale. "Welcome home, Elena," Victor said as the vehicle stopped in front of massive oak doors. "Your new life starts now." She stepped out into the cool night air, surrounded by armed guards and impossible wealth, owned by a man she'd met 20 minutes ago. Everything she'd known was gone. Everyone she'd been was erased. And somehow, standing on the threshold of Victor Hale's fortress, Elena Cross felt more present, more real, than she had in 26 years of trying to disappear. The oak doors opened, and she walked forward into the unknown. Inside Victor's estate, Elena discovered that wealth looked different when it wasn't apologizing for her existence. The entry hall alone was larger than her Brooklyn apartment, with soaring ceilings and artwork that probably cost more than her father spent hiding her away. But unlike Richard's cold, sterile penthouse, this space felt lived in, purposeful. Every detail chosen for function as much as beauty. A woman appeared from a side corridor, 50s, gray-haired, wearing a simple black dress and an expression of professional warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. She assessed Elena with the same thorough examination Victor had used, though her gaze lingered on the bruise with something that might have been sympathy. "This is Mrs. Chen," Victor said. "She manages the household. You'll answer to her for daily routines and basic needs. Mrs. Chen, this is Elena Cross. She's to have the East Wing suite, full access to common areas, and anything she requires within reason." Mrs. Chen nodded. "Of course, Mr. Hale. Miss Cross, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to your rooms." "Wait," Elena said, then immediately regretted the impulse when both Victor and Mrs. Chen turned to stare at her. But she'd started, so she forced herself to continue. "I don't understand the rules. You said I belong to you, but then you're giving me my own suite and access to your home like a guest. Which is it?" Victor's expression remained neutral, but one dark eyebrow rose fractionally. "You belong to me legally. That's non-negotiable. But I'm not a savage, Elena. You'll have privacy, autonomy within boundaries, and dignity. The alternative, treating you like a prisoner or a slave, serves no purpose except cruelty, and I'm not cruel without reason." "What are the boundaries?" Elena pressed, her heart hammering but her voice steadier than she'd expected. "No leaving the estate without permission and security escort. No contact with your father or his associates. No sharing information about this household, my business, or anything you see or hear while living here." Victor counted off each rule on his fingers like he was listing grocery items. "Follow those 3 rules and we'll coexist peacefully. Break them, and I will remind you very clearly that you are mine to discipline as I see fit." The threat should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost reassuring in its clarity. Victor Hale didn't hide behind politeness or passive aggression. He stated expectations and consequences. After a lifetime of navigating her father's shifting moods and unstated disappointments, the brutal honesty was almost refreshing. "I understand," Elena said. "Good." Victor gestured to Mrs. Chen. "Get her settled. Make sure she eats something. She looks half-starved. I'll speak with her tomorrow once she's had time to adjust." He disappeared down a different corridor, his security detail following like shadows, and Elena was left alone with the housekeeper. Mrs. Chen's expression softened infinitesimally. "This way, dear. You've had quite a night." The East Wing suite turned out to be larger than Elena's entire Brooklyn apartment, a bedroom with a 4-poster bed that could sleep 4 people, a sitting area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, a bathroom with a tub the size of a small pool, and a walk-in closet currently empty except for 3 designer dresses hanging with tags still attached. "Mr. Hale had these sent over this afternoon," Mrs. Chen explained, gesturing to the dresses. "He estimated your size. If they don't fit, I'll arrange for a proper fitting tomorrow. Your belongings from Brooklyn should arrive within the hour." Elena touched one of the dresses, soft silk in deep emerald green, cut in a style that would flatter rather than hide her curves. The price tag made her dizzy. One dress cost more than 3 months of the allowance her father gave her. "Why is he doing this?" she asked quietly. "Being kind when he doesn't have to be?" Mrs. Chen was silent for a long moment, adjusting already perfect pillows on the bed. "Mr. Hale values what belongs to him," she finally said. "He believes things should be maintained properly, treated with appropriate care. You are his now, so you will be cared for. It's not personal, Miss Cross. It's principle." The word should have stung. You are his now. Impersonal, transactional, but somehow they hurt less than her father's constant reminders that she was a burden, an embarrassment, a problem that required hiding. "I'll have dinner sent up," Mrs. Chen continued. "Something light, given the circumstances. Try to eat. Try to rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, and you'll need your strength." She left Elena alone in the beautiful suite, in the home of a dangerous stranger, in a life that had completely imploded in the space of 2 hours. Elena sat on the edge of the massive bed and finally let herself cry. Not dramatic sobs or theatrical breakdowns, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks, salt stinging the bruise her father had left like a parting gift. She cried for the family she'd never had, the love she'd never earned, the version of herself that had died tonight in that penthouse study. But underneath the grief, something else stirred.
something small and fragile but unmistakably present. Relief. She would never have to see her father's disappointment again, never have to make herself smaller to fit into spaces that didn't want her, never have to apologize for existing. Victor Hale might own her, might control her movements and dictate her life, but he'd looked at her, really looked at her, without contempt, without shame, just cool assessment and brutal honesty. It wasn't freedom, but it was something. A knock interrupted her thoughts. A young woman entered carrying a tray, simple pasta, salad, crusty bread, and sparkling water. "Mrs. Chen sent me, miss," the woman said, setting the tray on a small table near the windows. "Said you should eat. Mr. Hale doesn't like when people skip meals." Elena almost laughed at the absurdity. A crime lord concerned about her nutrition. "Thank you," she managed. The woman hesitated at the door. "It gets easier," she said softly. "Living here, I mean. Mr. Hale is intense, but he's fair, more fair than most of the men in his world. Just follow the rules and don't test boundaries you're not ready to face consequences for." Then she was gone, leaving Elena alone with food she didn't want and thoughts that wouldn't settle. She forced herself to eat anyway, mechanically chewing and swallowing while her mind spun through everything that had happened. The contract, Victor's cold examination, her father's casual cruelty, the promise of protection from a man who dealt in violence. By the time she finished, exhaustion had sunk into her bones. Elena changed into one of the silk nightgowns she found folded in the bathroom, another item Victor had apparently anticipated she'd need, and climbed into the enormous bed. Sleep should have been impossible, but her body, overwhelmed by trauma and shock, simply shut down. She dreamed of gray eyes and iron gates and a voice promising she would never be invisible again. When Elena woke, sunlight streamed through windows she'd forgotten to cover. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory crashed back. Her father's study, Victor's claim, this beautiful prison she now called home. A note had been slipped under her door during the night. Heavy cardstock, masculine handwriting, brief and direct. "Breakfast at 9. East dining room. Don't be late." V. Elena checked the clock. 8:45. She had 15 minutes to make herself presentable for the man who owned her. The fastest shower of her life. One of the designer dresses that fit perfectly, despite Victor only guessing her size. Minimal makeup to cover the bruise that had bloomed into spectacular purple overnight. She stared at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Same body her father had shamed, same face she'd learned to hide. But something in her eyes had changed. Fear, yes. Uncertainty, absolutely. But also a spark of something she hadn't seen in years. Determination. She found the East dining room with 2 minutes to spare, following the sound of quiet voices and the smell of fresh coffee. Victor sat at the head of a long mahogany table, reading something on a tablet, while Mrs. Chen supervised 2 staff members setting out breakfast. He looked up as Elena entered, those pale gray eyes tracking her movement from doorway to table. "You're prompt," he observed. "I appreciate that." "You said not to be late," Elena replied, then bit her lip. Was she supposed to speak unless spoken to? She had no idea what the protocol was for being someone's legal property. But Victor just gestured to the chair on his right. "Sit, eat. We have things to discuss." Elena sat, accepting coffee from a staff member who materialized at her elbow. The table was laden with options: eggs, fruit, pastries, yogurt, and she took small portions of each, hyper-aware of Victor watching her every move. "Your belongings arrived last night," Victor said, returning his attention to his tablet. "Mrs. Chen supervised the unpacking. If anything is missing or damaged, let her know, and I'll have it replaced." "Thank you," Elena said quietly. "I've also had my lawyers draw up documentation establishing you as part of this household. Bank account in your name with a monthly allowance, credit cards with reasonable limits, healthcare coverage. Everything you need to function without requiring my direct approval for basic expenses." Elena set down her fork, staring at him. "I don't understand. You own me. Why would you give me access to money and resources?" Victor finally looked up from his tablet, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "Because I own you,"
he said simply, which means your well-being reflects on me. You'll be well-fed, well-dressed, and well-provided for. Those aren't privileges, Elena. They're requirements of the arrangement. But my father, your father is a small petty man who confused control with power. Victor interrupted, his voice hard. I am not your father. The way I manage what belongs to me bears no resemblance to how he mismanaged you. Clear? Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. You'll also resume your education, Victor continued. Mrs. Chen tells me you were working toward a degree in art history before your father's financial manipulations made it difficult to continue. I've contacted Columbia. You'll start classes next semester. The room spun. You're sending me to Columbia? I'm ensuring you have options, Victor corrected. An education gives you skills, knowledge, independence within acceptable parameters. It also gives you purpose beyond existing in this house. You'll attend classes under security escort, you'll maintain appropriate discretion about your living situation, and you'll excel. Understood? Elena couldn't process the contradictions. This man had purchased her from her father like merchandise. He'd stated explicitly that she belonged to him, that he could discipline her as he saw fit, but now he was offering her education, autonomy, a pathway to something beyond captivity. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Victor set down his tablet with deliberate precision. Because I saw how your father looked at you last night, like you were a problem that needed solving, a liability that needed managing, and I decided that any man who could look at his own daughter with that much contempt deserves to watch her flourish despite him. This is about revenge? Elena's voice cracked on the word. This is about value, Victor replied. Your father threw away something that could be molded into an asset. I don't make the same mistakes. You will be educated, protected, and presented as someone of worth because that serves my interests. Your happiness is incidental, but your well-being is mandatory. Learn the difference. His words should have devastated her. Your happiness is incidental, but after a lifetime of being told her existence was a burden, being valued as an asset felt almost revolutionary. I'll follow your rules, Elena said. I'll do whatever you require, Elena shut. But I need to know, what exactly do you want from me? What's my purpose here beyond being a reminder to my father that you won? Victor studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze despite every instinct screaming at her to look away. Right now, he finally said, I want you to finish your breakfast, meet with the security team who'll be escorting you everywhere, and learn the boundaries of your new life. Later, we'll discuss longer-term expectations. But today, just focus on surviving the transition. That's enough. He stood, clearly ending the conversation. Mrs. Chen will coordinate your schedule. I have business to attend to. If you need anything, ask her. She'll determine whether it requires my direct approval. Victor walked out, leaving Elena alone with cold coffee and 1,000 unanswered questions. Mrs. Chen appeared moments later, her expression professionally sympathetic. Deep breath, dear. I know it's overwhelming. But, Mr. Hale isn't lying. Life here is structured, but it's not cruel. Follow the rules, don't test his patience, and you'll find your footing. Has he done this before? Elena asked. Taken someone in this way? Mrs. Chen's expression shuddered. Mr. Hale's private arrangements are not something I discuss. But I will say you're not the first person to arrive here confused and frightened, and everyone who follows the rules, who accepts their place in this household, finds that Mr. Hale takes care of his people very well. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of orientation. The security team, 4 men who introduced themselves with first names only and explained in clinical detail where Elena was allowed to go, what constituted emergency protocol, and how to signal if she felt threatened. A tour of the estate grounds, 23 acres of gardens, outbuildings, and perimeter walls that made the property feel more like a fortress than a home. A review of household expectations. Mealtimes, quiet hours, areas that were strictly off limits without explicit permission. By afternoon, Elena's head spun with information and her feet ached from walking the extensive grounds. She retreated to her suite, overwhelmed and exhausted. But when she entered her sitting room, she found something that stopped her cold. Her belongings from Brooklyn had been unpacked and arranged throughout the space. But more than that, the books she'd collected over years, The framed photos of places she'd visited alone because her father never wanted her company. The small sculptures she'd created in the art classes she'd paid for with money saved from her meager allowance. Everything she owned had been treated with care, respected, displayed like it mattered. Elena sank onto the couch, staring at her own life arranged in this stranger's home, and felt something shift in her chest. Victor Hale had purchased her to punish her father. He'd stated clearly she was property, an asset to be managed, but he'd also ensured her things were handled gently, that her education would continue, that she had resources and safety. She didn't understand him, didn't know if she could trust him. But for the first time in 26 years, someone was treating her like she deserved careful handling. Elena picked up one of her small sculptures, a rough clay figure she'd made in her first art class, all amateur enthusiasm and imperfect technique. Her father had mocked it, called it embarrassing proof of her lack of talent. But here, in Victor Hale's home, it sat on a shelf like it had value. Maybe she could survive this. Maybe being owned by a dangerous man was somehow better than being slowly erased by her own father. Maybe, Elena thought as she turned the sculpture in her hands, visibility came in unexpected forms. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to be seen. Elena's first week in Victor's estate passed in a strange rhythm of structure and silence. She woke each morning to find breakfast waiting in her suite. Mrs. Chen had quickly learned she preferred eating alone before facing the day. She attended meetings with tutors Victor had hired to prepare her for Columbia's rigorous program. She walked the gardens with her ever-present security detail trailing at a respectful distance. And every evening at 7, she joined Victor for dinner in the East Dining Room, where they ate in near silence while he reviewed documents and she pretended not to study him. He fascinated her in ways that made her uncomfortable. Victor Hale was nothing like the monster the newspapers described or the cruel master she'd feared. He was precise, controlled, and disturbingly attentive to details most people would overlook. He noticed when she barely touched her dinner and had Mrs. Chen adjust the menu. He observed her favoring her left ankle after walking the grounds too long and had a physical therapist sent to her suite. He saw everything, remembered everything, and responded with the clinical efficiency of someone managing a valuable investment. It should have felt cold. Instead, it felt like being seen for the first time in her life. On the 8th night, Victor broke their comfortable silence. "You're settling in well," he said, not looking up from the contract he was reviewing. "Mrs. Chen says you've memorized the household protocols and haven't tested any boundaries." Elena set down her fork carefully. "I'm following the rules. That's what you required." "It's more than that." Victor finally looked at her, those pale gray eyes sharp and assessing. "You're adapting, learning the rhythms of this house. Most people in your situation spend weeks in their rooms paralyzed by fear or resentment. You've done neither. Would you prefer I be difficult?" Elena asked, surprised by her own boldness. A slight smile touched Victor's mouth, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. "I'd prefer you be honest. So tell me, Elena, what are you really feeling about this arrangement?" The question caught her completely off guard. In her father's house, her feelings had been irrelevant at best, ammunition against her at worst, but Victor was asking like he genuinely wanted to know. "Confused," she admitted. "You purchased me from my father to punish him. You own me legally, but you treat me with more consideration than he ever did. I don't know how to reconcile those things." Victor pushed his plate aside, giving her his full attention in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Your father saw you as a liability. I see you as an asset with unrealized potential. The difference is perspective, not ownership. I told you before, I take care of what belongs to me. That includes ensuring you understand your value." "But I don't have value," Elena said quietly. "Not real value. I'm just a reminder that you can take things from powerful men who cross you." "Is that what you think?" Victor's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "That you're only symbolic?" Elena's hands trembled in her lap. "What else would I be?" Victor stood, moving around the table with predatory grace until he was standing directly beside her chair. Elena's breath caught as he reached down, his fingers gentle but firm as he tilted her face up to meet his eyes. "You're a 26-year-old woman who survived emotional abuse and systematic erasure without losing the capacity for kindness," Victor said, his voice quiet but intense. You're intelligent enough to pursue a degree your father actively sabotaged. You're resilient enough to adapt to captivity without breaking. And you're brave enough to ask me direct questions despite being terrified of the answers. That's real value, Elena. The kind that has nothing to do with your father and everything to do with who you are. His words hit her like physical blows, each one cracking through defenses she'd spent years building. No one had ever described her as brave, intelligent, resilient. She was the daughter who wasn't pretty enough, thin enough, accomplished enough to deserve acknowledgement. "I don't feel brave," she whispered. "Fear and bravery aren't opposites," Victor replied. "Bravery is being afraid and moving forward anyway. You do that every day you walk through this house instead of hiding in your suite." He released her face, stepping back, and Elena immediately missed the warmth of his touch. The realization disturbed her more than she wanted to examine. "Tomorrow you meet with the security team for advanced protocols," Victor continued, his tone shifting back to business. "I have associates visiting next week. You'll join us for dinner. I want them to see that Richard Cross's daughter is thriving under my care. It sends a message about the cost of betraying me." There it was. The reminder that she was still a tool, a weapon in Victor's larger war against her father. But somehow it stung less than it had before. "What should I wear?" Elena asked. "How should I behave?" "Wear whatever makes you feel confident. Behave like you belong here." Victor returned to his seat, picking up his documents. "You do belong here, Elena. The sooner you internalize that, the easier this becomes." Dinner ended shortly after, and Elena retreated to her suite with her mind spinning. Victor's words echoed through her thoughts as she prepared for bed, as she lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, as sleep finally claimed her in the early morning hours. "You do belong here." 3 days later, Elena stood in her walk-in closet staring at the collection of designer clothes Victor had provided, trying to decide what confident looked like. The dinner with his associates was in 2 hours, and she'd changed outfits 4 times already. Mrs. Chen knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit Elena had learned was standard in this household. Privacy existed at Victor's discretion, not as a guaranteed right. "You look terrified, dear," Mrs. Chen observed, surveying the rejected dresses scattered across the bed. "I don't know what he expects," Elena admitted. "He said to look confident, but I don't know how to do that in front of his world." Mrs. Chen picked up one of the dresses, a deep burgundy sheath that Elena had dismissed as too bold, and held it up critically. "Mr. Hale expects you to remember that you're under his protection. These men he's meeting with, they're dangerous, powerful, and they respect strength. You walk in there looking afraid, and they'll see weakness. You walk in there looking like you belong at Mr. Hale's table, and they'll see exactly what he wants them to see." "Which is what?" "That he takes care of his own. That crossing him costs more than money." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Wear the burgundy. It suits your coloring, and it's sophisticated without trying too hard. And Elena? Mr. Hale wouldn't be putting you in this position if he thought you'd fail. He's calculating about everything. Trust that he knows what he's doing." An hour later, Elena descended the main staircase in the burgundy dress, her hair styled in soft waves, minimal jewelry, heels that made her legs look longer than she'd thought possible. She felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Victor waited at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her father's monthly mortgage. He looked up as she approached, and something flickered in his eyes, there and gone so quickly she couldn't identify it. "Perfect," he said simply. Then he offered his arm. "Stay close. Speak when spoken to. Don't volunteer information about your father or your previous life. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, catch my eye and I'll handle it." Elena slipped her hand through his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath expensive fabric. "Are these people dangerous to me?" "Everyone in my world is dangerous," Victor replied as they walked toward the formal dining room. "But no one would be stupid enough to threaten something I've claimed. You're safer at this table than you were in your father's penthouse." The dining room had been transformed. The long table that usually sat empty except for Victor's solitary meals now hosted 8 place settings of crystal and china. 4 men were already seated, drinks in hand, conversation pausing as Victor entered with Elena. They were exactly what she'd expected, Expensive suits, predatory eyes, the kind of men who smiled while calculating exactly how to destroy you. But they stood when Victor entered, a show of respect that spoke volumes about the hierarchy in this room. "Gentlemen," Victor said, his hand settling possessively on Elena's lower back. "This is Elena Cross. She's part of my household now. You'll treat her accordingly." The message was clear. Touch her and die. The tallest of the men, silver-haired, probably 60, with scars that suggested a violent past, stepped forward with a calculating smile. "Richard Cross's daughter. I heard rumors about this arrangement. Quite the statement, Victor." "Dmitri," Victor acknowledged. "I trust the statement is clear?" "Crystal." Dmitri's eyes raked over Elena with professional assessment, and she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "She's lovelier than her father deserved. He always did undervalue his assets." Elena felt Victor's hand tighten fractionally against her back, a warning or reassurance, she wasn't sure which. The other men introduced themselves, Marcus, Chen, and someone who simply went by Saint, and Elena nodded politely to each while trying to remember that Victor had promised she was safe here, protected, untouchable. Dinner was an exercise in controlled tension. The men discussed business in coded language Elena couldn't fully decipher, but the underlying currents were clear enough. Territory disputes, revenue streams, people who'd made mistakes and paid for them. Victor presided over it all with calm authority, and Elena realized she was watching a king manage his court. She ate carefully, spoke only when directly addressed, and observed everything. The way Marcus deferred to Victor on every point. The way Chen watched her with barely concealed curiosity. The way Dmitri tested boundaries with comments designed to provoke reactions. "I heard Richard tried to negotiate after the contract was signed," Dmitri said midway through the main course, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "Claimed he had other assets that would better serve your purposes." Victor's expression didn't change. "Richard Cross's assets are no longer my concern. I took what I wanted. The rest can rot with his failing empire." "And what you wanted was his daughter." Dmitri smiled. "Sentimental of you, Victor. I didn't know you had it in you." The temperature in the room dropped. Elena felt every man at the table tense, waiting for Victor's response. "What I wanted," Victor said softly, "was to ensure Richard Cross understands that betrayal costs more than money. It costs the things you love. Or in his case, the things you should have loved but were too short-sighted to value appropriately." He looked at Elena as he spoke, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not affection. Victor Hale didn't deal in soft emotions. But possession, pride. The look of someone who'd acquired exactly what they'd intended. "Elena is an asset that will appreciate under proper management," Victor continued, his gaze still locked on hers. "Something her father never understood. His loss. My gain." Dmitri laughed, breaking the tension. "Well played. Nothing burns quite like watching something you threw away flourish in someone else's hands." The conversation moved on, but Elena sat frozen, Victor's words echoing through her mind. An asset that will appreciate under proper management. She should have been insulted, reduced to investment terminology, discussed like stock options. Instead, she felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Victor saw potential in her. He believed she would flourish. No one in her entire life had ever said anything like that. The dinner lasted 3 more hours. By the time the men departed, with promises of future meetings and thinly veiled threats toward mutual enemies, Elena was exhausted from maintaining her composed facade. Victor walked her back to her suite, his hand still possessive against her spine. They climbed the stairs in silence, and Elena tried not to think about how natural his touch had started to feel. At her door, Victor paused. "You did well tonight. Better than I expected for your first exposure to my world." "I barely said 10 words," Elena replied. "Exactly. You listened, observed, and didn't draw unnecessary attention. That's intelligence." Victor studied her face with that unnerving intensity. "Dmitri was testing you with those comments about your father. You didn't take the bait. That's discipline. I'm impressed." The praise hit harder than it should have. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks and hated herself for the reaction. I just did what you asked. You did more than that. You held your own in a room full of dangerous men without showing fear. That takes strength most people don't have. Victor's hand came up, fingers brushing her jaw in a gesture that felt almost tender. You're not what your father told you that you were, Elena. The sooner you accept that, the stronger you'll become. He stepped back, his expression shuddering back to neutral. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll discuss your class schedule for next semester. Good night. Victor disappeared down the hallway, leaving Elena standing outside her suite with her heart racing and her carefully constructed defenses in shambles. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay in bed replaying every moment of the dinner, every word Victor had spoken, every time his hand had pressed against her back like she was something worth protecting. This was dangerous. Getting attached to her captor, finding validation in his assessment of her value, craving his approval like she'd once desperately sought her father's. Elena knew all the psychological explanations for what was happening. Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding, the human need for connection even in captivity. But knowing the clinical terms didn't make the feelings less real. Victor Hale owned her legally, controlled her movements, dictated her life. But he also saw her, valued her, believed she could be more than her father's discarded liability. And Elena was terrified to realize she wanted to prove him right. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a strange domesticity. Elena met with tutors, prepared for Columbia, walked the grounds with her security detail. But the real change was in her interactions with Victor. Their dinners became actual conversations, him asking about her progress, her cautiously inquiring about his business, both of them dancing around the growing awareness that something was shifting between them. He still owned her. The contract still existed. But the dynamic was evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. It all came to a head on a Friday evening when Elena made a mistake. She'd been reading in the library, a massive room she'd been told was accessible whenever she wanted, and lost track of time. By the time she checked her phone, it was nearly 8. Dinner started at 7 sharp. She was an hour late. Elena ran through the hallways, her heart pounding, knowing Victor valued punctuality, and she'd just disrespected his primary rule about shared meals. She burst into the dining room, breathless and apologetic, expecting to find him angry. Instead, Victor sat alone at the table, his expression unreadable, 2 plates of food grown cold in front of him. I'm so sorry, Elena gasped. I was reading and I lost track of time, and I know that's not an excuse, but stop talking, Victor interrupted quietly. Elena's mouth snapped shut. She'd never heard that particular tone from him before. Not angry, not cold, just infinitely patient in a way that somehow felt worse. Victor stood, moving around the table until he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. You broke a rule, he said. What happens when you break my rules, Elena? Her throat went dry. You said you'd discipline me. I did say that. Victor's hand came up, fingers threading through her hair with deceptive gentleness. And I keep my promises. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go to your suite. You're going to think very carefully about why punctuality matters in this household. And tomorrow morning, you're going to explain to me why I shouldn't restrict your access to the library. It wasn't the punishment Elena had feared. No violence, no cruelty. But the disappointment in Victor's voice cut deeper than any physical consequence could have. I understand, she whispered. Do you? Victor's grip tightened slightly in her hair, forcing her to hold his gaze. Because from where I'm standing, you understand rules but not reasons. I don't demand punctuality because I'm controlling, Elena. I demand it because in my world, being where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there keeps you alive. 1 hour late to dinner tonight. 1 hour late to a security escort tomorrow. See the difference? Understanding crashed through her. Every rule Victor had established wasn't about control for its own sake. It was about keeping her safe in a world where tardiness could mean kidnapping or worse. I'm sorry, Elena said again, meaning it differently this time. I didn't think about the larger implications. No, you didn't. Which is why we're having this conversation. Victor released her hair, stepping back. You're dismissed. We'll talk in the morning. Elena fled to her suite, shame burning through her chest. She'd disappointed him. After weeks of trying to prove she could adapt to his world, she'd failed at something as simple as being on time. She spent the night composing explanations, justifications, apologies. But when morning came and she stood in Victor's study, summoned by a terse note from Mrs. Chen, all her prepared words evaporated. Victor sat behind his desk, dressed in casual clothes she'd never seen him wear, looking somehow more dangerous in jeans and a fitted black shirt than he did in his tailored suits. "Explain," he said without preamble. Elena took a breath. "There's no good explanation. I got absorbed in a book and forgot to check the time. It was careless and disrespectful to your rules and the reasons behind them. I understand that being unreliable in your world creates vulnerabilities. It won't happen again." Victor studied her for a long moment. "What were you reading?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" "The book that made you lose track of time. What was it?" "A history of Renaissance art," Elena admitted. "I found it in your library. It's part of the Columbia curriculum and I wanted to get ahead, and why does that matter?" "Because I need to understand whether you were being deliberately defiant or genuinely distracted." Victor leaned back in his chair. "Defiance I punish severely. Distraction I correct with better systems." "I wasn't defying you," Elena said quickly. "I would never." "Stop." Victor held up one hand. "Don't make promises you can't keep. Everyone defies eventually. What matters is whether the defiance is stupid or strategic." He pulled a small box from his desk drawer and slid it across the polished wood. "Open it." Elena approached cautiously, picking up the box. Inside was a watch, elegant, expensive, with alarm functions and what looked like a panic button. "You'll wear this at all times," Victor said. "It's set to remind you 15 minutes before any scheduled commitment. It also has GPS tracking and emergency alert capabilities. If you're ever in trouble, press the button and my security team responds immediately." Elena stared at the watch, then at Victor. "You're giving me a safety device because I was late to dinner?" "I'm giving you a tool to prevent future mistakes while keeping you protected," Victor corrected. "The library access stays, but you'll be accountable for your time. Fair?" It was more than fair. It was thoughtful. Elena felt something crack open in her chest, the careful distance she'd been maintaining to protect herself from getting too attached to this arrangement. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me. Just prove you can handle the freedom I'm giving you." Victor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I meant what I said, Elena. You're not your father's liability. You're capable of more than you've been allowed to believe, but capability requires responsibility. Show me you understand that." Elena nodded, clutching the watch like a lifeline. "I will. I promise." "Good. Now get out of here. Mrs. Chen has your class schedule for next week. Review it and let me know if anything conflicts with your other commitments." Elena turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Victor, why do you believe in me when I don't even believe in myself?" He looked up, those pale gray eyes seeing straight through her carefully constructed defenses. "Because I've spent my entire life evaluating assets and liabilities. You, Elena Cross, are the most undervalued asset I've ever acquired, and I don't make mistakes about these things." She left his study with tears burning behind her eyes and a watch on her wrist that felt like both a leash and a promise. 3 days later, everything changed. Elena was in the garden when the first shot rang out. She'd been studying on a stone bench near the fountain, her security detail positioned at respectful distances, the afternoon sun warm on her shoulders. The watch Victor had given her showed 3:15. She had 45 minutes before her meeting with the Columbia admissions coordinator. Plenty of time to finish the chapter on Baroque architecture. Then the world exploded into chaos. The bullet hit the fountain behind her, sending shards of marble spraying across the garden. Elena's mind went blank with shock, her body frozen as her security detail erupted into coordinated violence. Marcus, the lead guard assigned to her, tackled her to the ground, his body covering hers as more gunfire echoed through the estate. "Stay down," Marcus barked into her ear, his weight crushing but protective. "Do not move. Do not look up. Understood?" Elena couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She nodded against the grass, tasting dirt and terror, her ears ringing from the gunshots that kept coming in rapid succession. Marcus was shouting into his radio, words Elena couldn't process through the roaring panic in her head. More security personnel appeared from seemingly nowhere, forming a human shield around her position. Someone was returning fire. Someone was screaming. And through it all, Elena's mind kept circling back to one horrifying realization. Someone was trying to kill her. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours. When silence finally fell, heavy and terrible, Marcus carefully lifted his weight off Elena's back. "Miss Cross, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice steady despite the blood streaming from a cut on his temple. "We're going to move you to the house. I need you to stay low, stay between us, and move fast. Can you do that?" Elena managed a jerky nod. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely push herself up from the ground. Her beautiful burgundy dress, the one she'd worn to Victor's dinner, the one that made her feel confident, was torn and stained with grass and dirt. Marcus hauled her to her feet, and Elena got her first real look at the aftermath. 2 men in black tactical gear lay motionless near the perimeter wall. Blood pooled on the perfect lawn. Her security detail had weapons drawn, eyes scanning for additional threats. They moved her through the garden at a run, Marcus on one side and another guard she didn't recognize on the other, practically carrying her when her legs threatened to give out. The house loomed ahead like a fortress, and Elena had never been so grateful for Victor's paranoid security measures. They burst through a side entrance Elena had never used, descending stairs she didn't know existed, until they were in what could only be described as a bunker. Reinforced walls, multiple monitors showing security feeds, weapons cabinets, a space designed for exactly this kind of emergency. Victor was already there. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by his core security team, his expression carved from ice as he listened to rapid-fire reports from multiple sources. But the moment Elena stumbled through the door, his attention snapped to her with laser focus. "Injuries," he demanded, his eyes raking over her with clinical precision. "Minor cuts, possible bruising, but she's intact," Marcus reported. "We neutralized 2 hostiles. 3rd escaped over the north wall. Perimeter is secure, but we're sweeping for additional threats." Victor crossed the space in 3 strides, his hands gripping Elena's shoulders as he turned her, examining her for damage the way someone might inspect valuable property after an accident. His touch was impersonal but thorough, and Elena stood frozen, still too shocked to process what was happening. "Look at me," Victor commanded. Elena raised her eyes to his, and something flickered in that cold gray gaze. Fury. Not at her, but for her. The kind of rage that promised biblical retribution. "You're safe now," Victor said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Do you understand me, Elena? You are safe. No one will touch you here." She nodded, but tears were streaming down her face before she could stop them. The delayed shock was crashing through her system, making her shake so hard her teeth chattered. Victor pulled her against his chest without hesitation, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other wrapped around her waist. "Breathe," he ordered softly. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. You survived. You're here. Breathe." Elena clung to him, her fingers digging into expensive fabric, sobbing against his shoulder while he held her with surprising tenderness. Around them, his security team pretended not to notice their boss comforting the woman he'd claimed as property, continuing their tactical assessments and threat evaluations. "Who?" Elena finally managed to gasp. Why would anyone—" "Your father," Victor said flatly, and Elena felt him go rigid with controlled violence. "This has Richard Cross written all over it. A pathetic attempt to reclaim what he gave away, or more likely, to eliminate evidence of his failure." Elena pulled back, staring at him in horror. "My father tried to have me killed?" "Your father hired incompetent mercenaries to either kidnap or kill you. I'm not sure which yet," Victor corrected, his jaw tight. "But the message is clear. He'd rather see you dead than thriving under my protection. It makes him look weak, foolish. He can't tolerate that." The words hit like physical blows. Her own father. The man who'd given birth to her, raised her, however poorly, had just tried to end her life because she represented an embarrassment he couldn't control. "I'm going to be sick," Elena whispered. Victor guided her to a chair, crouching in front of her while she bent over, breathing hard against the nausea. His hands gripped her knees, grounding her, keeping her present.
Listen to me very carefully, Victor said, his voice hard but not unkind. Your father made the worst mistake of his miserable life today. He attacked what belongs to me. He put you in danger, and I am going to make him pay for that in ways he cannot begin to imagine. Elena looked up, meeting those pale gray eyes that promised death and destruction. What are you going to do? What I should have done the moment he raised his hand to you in that penthouse, Victor replied. I'm going to destroy him completely. His business, his reputation, his freedom, everything he values will turn to ash.
And he'll know it's because he was stupid enough to come after you. Because I'm your property, Elena said, her voice hollow. Victor's expression shifted, something almost like frustration crossing his features. Because you're under my protection. Because you matter. And because anyone who tries to hurt you answers to me. He stood, addressing Marcus without taking his eyes off Elena. She doesn't leave this bunker until I personally clear the estate. Double the perimeter guards. I want every inch of this property searched. And get me everything you can find on Richard Cross's movements in the last 48 hours. Marcus nodded and began barking orders into his radio. The security team dispersed, leaving Elena alone with Victor in the reinforced space that suddenly felt very small. I need you to be honest with me, Victor said, pulling over a chair and sitting so they were eye level. Has your father contacted you since you came here? Any messages, calls, attempts to reach you? Elena shook her head. Nothing. You said no contact and I followed the rule. Good, but he might try now, pretend he's worried, offer to rescue you from the monster who took you. Victor's smile was cold and cruel. If he does, you're going to play along. Tell him you're scared, that you want to leave, whatever he needs to hear, and then you're going to lead him straight into the trap I'm building. The request should have horrified her, using herself as bait to destroy her own father. But Elena thought about the gunshots in the garden, the way Marcus had covered her body with his own, the casual cruelty of a man willing to kill his daughter rather than let her exist beyond his control. What do you need me to do? She asked. Victor studied her for a long moment. You understand what I'm asking? This isn't passive cooperation. This is active participation in your father's destruction. He just tried to kill me, Elena said, and her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. Or kidnap me. Either way, he made it very clear I'm only valuable to him as leverage or as a corpse. So yes, Victor, I understand exactly what you're asking, and I want to help. Something like approval flashed in Victor's eyes. Then we're going to make Richard Cross regret every decision that led him to this moment. But first, you need to rest. You've had a significant shock and your body needs time to process the trauma. He stood, offering his hand. Elena took it, letting him pull her to her feet. She expected him to release her immediately, but Victor kept her hand in his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that felt almost protective. You were very brave today, he said quietly, following Marcus's instructions without panic, staying calm during the extraction. Most people would have frozen or done something stupid that got them killed. I was terrified, Elena admitted. Bravery and terror aren't mutually exclusive. You can be both. Victor's free hand came up, fingers gentle as they brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. You're stronger than you know, Elena. Today proved that. The tenderness in his touch, the unexpected praise, the way he was looking at her like she was something precious instead of just valuable. It was too much. Elena felt her carefully maintained distance crumbling, replaced by something dangerous and complicated. Why do you care? She whispered. I'm just property, a tool to punish my father. Why does it matter if I'm brave or terrified? Victor's jaw tightened. Because you stopped being just a tool the moment you walked into my home and proved you were worth more than your father ever realized. Because watching you flourish under my protection gives me more satisfaction than any business victory. And because... He stopped abruptly, something unreadable crossing his face. Because you matter, Elena. To this household. To me. And I protect what matters. Before Elena could respond, before she could examine the implications of Victor admitting she mattered to him personally, the bunker door opened. Mrs. Chen appeared, her expression professionally calm despite the chaos upstairs. The guest suite in the secure wing is prepared, Mrs. Chen said. I've brought fresh clothes, and the doctor is on his way to examine Miss Cross. Victor nodded, finally releasing Elena's hand. Take her upstairs. Make sure she eats something. I'll join you after I've handled the immediate security concerns. Mrs. Chen guided Elena out of the bunker, up different stairs, through hallways Elena had never seen. The secure wing was exactly what it sounded like, a fortress within the fortress, with reinforced doors and security measures that made the rest of the estate look welcoming by comparison. The guest suite was smaller than her usual rooms, but somehow more comfortable. Mrs. Chen helped her out of the ruined dress, tisking over the bruises already forming on Elena's ribs from where Marcus had tackled her. That man saved your life, Mrs. Chen said gently, helping Elena into soft cotton pants and an oversized sweater. Mr. Hale handpicks his security team. They're loyal to the death because he treats them like family. You can trust them completely. Elena sank onto the bed, exhaustion hitting her like a wave. Has this happened before? Attacks on the estate? Mrs. Chen's expression closed off slightly. Mr. Hale has enemies. That's the nature of his business. But no one has been foolish enough to target someone under his direct protection. Until today. She paused, then added carefully, Your father has made a catastrophic error, Miss Cross. Mr. Hale doesn't forgive threats to what he considers his. What comes next won't be pretty, but it will be thorough. A knock interrupted them. The doctor arrived, a compact woman in her 50s who examined Elena with brisk efficiency, checking her vitals, looking for signs of concussion, cataloging the bruises. Physically, you're fine, the doctor pronounced. Emotionally, you've experienced significant trauma. I'm prescribing something mild to help you sleep tonight. If you experience flashbacks, nightmares, or intrusive thoughts, let Mrs. Chen know, and we'll adjust the treatment. After the doctor left, Mrs. Chen brought soup and bread, standing over Elena until she'd eaten most of it. Then she dimmed the lights, leaving one lamp burning in the corner. Mr. Hale will check on you when he's finished with security matters, Mrs. Chen said. Try to rest. You're safe here. Elena lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the attack in vivid detail. The sound of the gunshot, the impact of Marcus's body hitting hers, the taste of dirt and terror, her father's calculated decision that she was worth more dead than alive. She must have dozed, because when she opened her eyes again, Victor was sitting in the chair beside her bed, still dressed in the same clothes from earlier, but looking somehow more worn. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing muscular forearms marked with old scars. He was watching her with an intensity that should have been unsettling but somehow felt safe. What time is it? Elena asked, her voice rough from sleep. Just past midnight, Victor replied. I'm sorry I woke you. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Elena pushed herself up to sitting, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Did you find out anything? About who sent them? Enough. Victor's expression turned cold. The men Marcus neutralized were hired through a third party, but the money trail leads back to one of your father's shell companies. He tried to cover his tracks but did it sloppily. Desperation makes people stupid. What happens now? Victor leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on hers. Now I give you a choice. You can stay here, protected and safe, while I handle your father. Or you can be part of the process, active instead of passive. But I need to know what you want, Elena. This is your life, your trauma. You get to decide how we respond. The fact that he was asking, that Victor Hale, who'd purchased her from her father and claimed legal ownership, was giving her agency in this decision, meant more than Elena could articulate. I want to be part of it, she said firmly. I want him to know I chose this. That I'm not a victim he can manipulate or a liability he can eliminate. I want him to see exactly what he threw away. Victor's smile was predatory and proud. Then we do this together. But Elena, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. Your father is going to be destroyed, financially, socially, legally. When we're done, he'll have nothing. Can you live with that? Elena thought about 26 years of conditional love and systematic erasure. About being told she was too fat, too stupid, too embarrassing to deserve basic acknowledgement. About standing in that penthouse while her father calculated her value in dollars and decided she was worth more as payment than as a daughter. I can live with it, she said. What I can't live with is letting him think he can take shots at me without consequences. Good answer. Victor stood, but instead of leaving, he sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that Elena could feel his body heat. I need to tell you something. When I got the alert that there was an attack, when I saw on the monitors that you were in the garden, he stopped, his jaw working like he was struggling with unfamiliar emotions. I've never felt fear like that. Not for myself, not for my empire. But the thought of losing you before you'd even had a chance to become who you're meant to be, it was intolerable. Elena's breath caught. Victor, you're not just property to me anymore, he continued, his voice low and intense. Maybe you never were. Maybe from the moment I saw how your father looked at you, saw the bruise on your face, saw the way you held yourself like you were apologizing for existing, maybe from that first moment, I knew you were something more. Something worth protecting for reasons that have nothing to do with punishing Richard Cross. He reached out, his hand cupping her face with devastating gentleness. You matter to me, Elena. Not as an asset, not as a tool. As a person I want to see flourish. And today, someone tried to take that away. Tried to take you away. That cannot stand. Elena leaned into his touch, her eyes burning with unshed tears. I don't know how to do this. Trust someone who owns me. Care about someone who bought me like property. It's complicated and confusing and probably unhealthy, but it's real, Victor finished. And real is messy. Real doesn't follow the rules we think it should. I bought you to punish your father. You came here as a captive. But somewhere in these weeks something changed. For both of us. What do we do about it? Elena whispered. Right now? Nothing. You heal. We destroy your father, and then, when the dust settles, we figure out what this is between us. Victor's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. But know this, you're not a prisoner here anymore. You're not property. You're under my protection by choice now, your choice. If you want to leave after we handle your father, I won't stop you. If you want to stay, you'll stay as someone I value, not someone I own. The offer of freedom should have made her relieved. Instead, Elena felt panic flutter in her chest at the thought of leaving this fortress, leaving Victor's protection, leaving the first place she'd ever felt truly seen. I don't want to leave, she admitted. Then stay, Victor said simply. Stay, and let me show you what your life looks like when someone values you the way you deserve. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed his lips to her forehead in a kiss that felt like a promise. Then he stood, moving back toward the door. Sleep, he ordered gently. Tomorrow we start planning your father's downfall. Together. Victor left, and Elena sat in the darkness, her fingers touching the spot where his lips had been, her mind spinning with the realization that she was falling for the man who'd bought her, that she trusted him more than anyone in her life, that the thought of helping destroy her father felt less like revenge and more like justice. She slept better than she had in years. The next morning, Elena woke to find Victor had left detailed plans on the table in her sitting room. Diagrams, financial records, evidence of her father's crimes that went far beyond their personal arrangement. As she studied the documents, she realized Victor had been building a case against Richard Cross for months, long before the attack in the garden. Mrs. Chen appeared with breakfast and a knowing look. Mr. Hale is in his study. He asked that you join him when you're ready. Elena dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made her feel strong rather than pretty. Black pants, fitted shirt, hair pulled back. She looked like someone who meant business, someone who wouldn't back down. Victor's study was a command center. Multiple screens showed financial data, security feeds, and what looked like surveillance photos of her father's movements. Victor stood in the center of it all, orchestrating destruction with the same precision he applied to everything. He looked up when Elena entered, his eyes tracking her from head to toe in that assessing way she'd come to recognize as his version of concern. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Elena admitted. "What's all this?" "This is how we take down an empire," Victor replied, gesturing to the screens. "Your father built his reputation on appearing untouchable. Old money, legitimate businesses. But underneath, he's running schemes that would make organized crime look ethical. Tax evasion, embezzlement, fraud. I've been collecting evidence for months. Now we use it." Elena moved closer, studying the documents. Why wait? You could have destroyed him already. Because I wanted him to think he'd gotten away with it, wanted him comfortable and careless. Victor's smile was cold. And because I wanted you to be part of his destruction. You deserve that satisfaction. He pulled up another screen, and Elena felt her stomach drop. It was surveillance footage from the garden attack, showing the moment the first shot was fired, the way her security detail had responded, the brutal efficiency of the takedown. Your father paid those men $30,000 to either bring you back or eliminate you, Victor said flatly. The contract specified they could choose whichever option proved easier. Your life was worth $30,000 to the man who created you. The casual cruelty of it, the dollar amount assigned to her existence, should have broken her. Instead, it crystallized her resolve into something diamond hard. What do you need me to do? Elena asked. Victor turned to face her fully. Tomorrow, your father is going to receive a carefully worded message from a supposedly concerned friend. This friend will claim to have seen you at a restaurant looking distressed. Your father will take the bait because he's desperate to know if his hired help succeeded. When he responds, you're going to call him. And say what? That you're terrified. That you want to come home. That you've made a terrible mistake trusting me over him. Victor's eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. He'll try to arrange a meeting, somewhere public where he thinks he has the advantage, and we'll be waiting. Elena took a breath. He'll know I'm lying. He knows I hate him. He knows the version of you who was afraid to speak up. The daughter who accepted his cruelty because she thought she deserved it. Victor stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the best way. He doesn't know the woman you're becoming, the one who survived an assassination attempt and decided to fight back. Use his expectations against him. Be the victim he thinks you are. And when he's vulnerable, we strike. This is really happening, Elena said, not quite believing it. We're actually going to destroy him. We're going to give him exactly what he gave you, Victor corrected. Betrayal, abandonment, the realization that everything he valued was built on sand. And you're going to look him in the eye while his world burns and know that you helped light the match. Elena felt something fierce and powerful unfurl in her chest. Not revenge, something cleaner than that. Justice, accountability, the absolute certainty that Richard Cross would finally pay for his cruelty. When do we start? She asked. Victor's smile was proud and predatory. We already have. The message went out at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning. Elena watched from Victor's study as he monitored the digital trail, tracking the moment Richard Cross's phone pinged with the carefully crafted warning from his supposed associate. The message was perfect in its calculated concern, vague enough to seem authentic, specific enough to trigger her father's paranoia. He's reading it now, Victor said, his eyes on one of the monitors showing Richard's phone activity. Heart rate elevated based on his smartwatch data. He's stressed. Good. Elena stood beside him, her own heart pounding despite the clinical nature of the operation. Somewhere across the city, her father was learning that his assassination attempt had failed, that she was alive and potentially vulnerable. She wondered what he felt in that moment. Relief? Frustration? Renewed determination to finish what he'd started? Give him 2 hours, Victor continued, his voice calm and controlled. Long enough to panic, to make calls, to confirm his hired help is dead or missing. Then you call him from this number. He handed Elena a burner phone. It'll show as coming from a blocked number, but he'll recognize your voice. That's what matters. Elena took the phone, her fingers closing around the cheap plastic. 2 hours to prepare. 2 hours to become the frightened, desperate daughter her father expected. 2 hours to commit to a performance that would determine everything. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway with tea and what looked like cucumber sandwiches, as if they were planning a garden party instead of orchestrating someone's destruction. You should eat something, Miss Cross, and perhaps rest. You'll need your voice to sound appropriately distressed. It was such a practical observation that Elena almost laughed, but she forced down half a sandwich and sipped the tea, letting the familiar ritual ground her while Victor worked through security protocols and contingency plans. When he asks to meet you, suggest the Carlisle Hotel restaurant, Victor said, pulling up blueprints on another screen. It's public enough that he'll feel safe, but we control the entire 5th floor. Security positioned as guests, exits monitored, surveillance covering every angle. He won't know he's walking into a trap until it's too late. What happens when he arrives? Elena asked. Victor's smile was cold. You'll be wearing a wire. Every word he says will be recorded. We need him to confess, not just to the attack, but to everything. The embezzlement. The fraud. His real reasons for trading you to me. Once we have his confession on tape, I hand everything to the federal prosecutor who's been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. He goes to prison, Elena said slowly, understanding the full scope of what Victor had planned. He goes to prison for a very long time. His assets get frozen and eventually seized. His reputation becomes a cautionary tale. And you... Victor turned to face her fully, his expression softer than she'd seen it. You get to walk away from him forever, knowing he can never touch you again. The enormity of it settled over Elena like a weight. Not just revenge, complete and total liberation, the legal, permanent end to her father's control over any aspect of her life. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. You should be. This is dangerous. Victor's hand came up, fingers gentle against her jaw. But you're not alone. I'll be in the restaurant, 3 tables away, watching everything. My security team will be positioned throughout the building. And if at any moment you feel unsafe, you say the code word and we extract you immediately. What's the code word? Renaissance, Victor said. From that art history book you got lost in. Easy to work into conversation naturally. The moment I hear it, we shut everything down and get you out. Elena nodded, committing it to memory. Renaissance, her escape route if everything went wrong. The 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Victor's tech specialist fitted Elena with a wire so thin and sophisticated it was invisible beneath her clothes. They rehearsed potential conversations, anticipating her father's questions and crafting responses that would draw out his confession without seeming obviously leading. And through it all, Victor remained calm and controlled, a steady presence that kept Elena's panic at manageable levels. At 11 o'clock, Victor handed her the burner phone. It's time. Remember, you're scared, confused, desperate to escape. He needs to believe you're still the broken daughter he traded away. Can you do that? Elena took a breath, letting herself sink into the role. The frightened girl she'd been in her father's penthouse. The one who apologized for existing and accepted cruelty as love. That version of herself still lived inside her, just buried under the strength she'd developed in Victor's home. She dialed her father's private number, the one he'd given her years ago with strict instructions to only use in emergencies. It rang 3 times before he answered, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. Who is this? Daddy? Elena let her voice shake, pitching it higher and younger than her natural tone. It's me. It's Elena. Silence stretched across the line, heavy with calculation. Then Richard's voice came back smoother, concerned in a way that made her skin crawl. Elena, sweetheart, where are you? Are you all right? I've been so worried since you tried to have me killed. The words escaped before Elena could stop them, too raw and honest for the role she was supposed to play. Another pause. Then Richard laughed, and it was the most chilling sound Elena had ever heard. Is that what Victor told you? That I would hurt my own daughter? Elena, he's manipulating you, playing on your insecurities to turn you against your family. You have to know I would never... The men had photos of me, Elena interrupted, Victor's coached responses coming back to her. Surveillance photos, movement patterns. They knew exactly where I'd be in the garden that day. Victor's men, Richard said quickly, staged to make it look like I was responsible. Don't you see? He's creating a narrative where you're unsafe everywhere except with him. It's textbook manipulation, sweetheart. You're smarter than this. Elena met Victor's eyes across the study. He nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. I don't know what to believe anymore, Elena said, letting genuine tears creep into her voice. I'm so confused and scared, and I just want this to be over. I want to come home. She could practically hear her father smile through the phone. Of course you do, and I want that too, sweetheart. We can fix this. All of it. Victor's contract isn't as ironclad as he thinks. I have lawyers looking into it right now, but I need you to meet me, somewhere we can talk privately without his surveillance. He watches everything, Elena whispered. I can't just leave. The security detail. You're my daughter, not his prisoner. You have rights. Richard's voice took on the commanding tone she remembered from childhood. Tomorrow, lunch. The Carlisle Hotel restaurant, 1 o'clock. It's public enough that Victor won't risk making a scene. Can you get there? Elena pretended to hesitate. I think so. There's a routine security shift change at noon. If I time it right. Good girl. Smart girl. The approval in Richard's voice made her stomach turn. Come alone. If Victor or his people show up, I walk away and you're stuck in his world forever. Understand? I understand, Elena said. Tomorrow at 1. I'll be there. Wear something nice, Richard added. Something that reminds you of who you really are, not whatever costume Victor's dressed you in to play his games. The line went dead. Elena lowered the phone, her hands shaking for real now. Victor crossed to her immediately, his presence grounding and solid. You were perfect, he said quietly. Better than I expected. He bought every word. He thinks I'm still the same broken girl, Elena replied, her voice hollow. He actually believes I'd come running back to him after everything he's done. That's exactly what we need him to believe. Victor took the phone from her trembling fingers. The arrogance of men like your father is what destroys them. He can't conceive of you growing beyond his limited perception. That blindness is his fatal flaw. Elena sank into a chair, the adrenaline draining out of her system and leaving exhaustion in its wake. What if something goes wrong? What if he realizes it's a trap? Then we adapt. Victor crouched in front of her, his hands covering hers. But nothing is going to go wrong because we've planned for every contingency. You walk in, you sit down, you let him talk. He'll confess because men like him can't resist explaining exactly how clever they are. And when he does, we have him. And then it's over, Elena whispered. He goes away forever, and I'm free. Victor's expression softened in a way she'd rarely seen. And then, you get to decide what your life looks like. No father controlling you, no contract binding you, just choices, Elena, all yours. The next 24 hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Elena tried to focus on her Columbia prep work, on walking the gardens with her security detail, on anything that would distract her from the confrontation looming ahead. But her mind kept circling back to the restaurant, the wire beneath her clothes, the moment she'd have to look her father in the eye and pretend she still wanted his approval. Victor was constantly present, but not smothering. He checked on her throughout the day, ensured she ate, sat with her during dinner, and let the silence be comfortable instead of tense. And that night, when Elena couldn't sleep, she found him in the library reading through final preparations. Tomorrow changes everything, she said from the doorway. Victor looked up, setting aside his tablet. It does. Are you ready? Elena crossed to where he sat, curling into the chair beside him. I don't know if ready is the right word, but I'm committed. Does that count? It counts more. Victor studied her in the low lamplight. You could still walk away, call him back, cancel the meeting, live under my protection without ever confronting him directly. I'd understand. No, you wouldn't, Elena said with a slight smile. You'd think I was weak, that I let fear win. I'd think you were being smart about self-preservation, Victor corrected. There's no shame in choosing safety over confrontation. Elena shook her head. I need to do this. Not for revenge, not even for justice, really. I need to look at him and know I'm not afraid anymore, that he doesn't have power over me, that I survived him and became stronger because of it. Victor reached out, his fingers threading through hers. Then tomorrow, you show him exactly that. You walk into that restaurant as the woman you've become, not the daughter he remembers, and you let him see what he threw away. They sat together in the quiet library until Elena's eyes grew heavy and Victor walked her back to her suite. At her door, he paused, his hand still holding hers. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said quietly, know that you've already won. You're not his anymore. You never will be again. Will be. Elena stood on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek, brief, chaste, but loaded with everything she couldn't articulate. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Victor's free hand came up to cup her face. Thank you for being worth seeing. He left her at the threshold, and Elena slept better than she had any right to, wrapped in the strange security of knowing tomorrow would either free her completely or destroy her entirely. Morning came too fast and too slow. Mrs. Chen helped Elena dress in a navy sheath dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, professional but not cold. Her hair fell in soft waves, minimal makeup, the overall effect suggesting a woman in control rather than a girl seeking approval. The wire went on first, the tech specialist checking levels and making sure every word would be crystal clear on the recording. Then Victor himself did a final check, his hands gentle but thorough as he ensured the equipment was invisible and secure. "You remember the code word?" he asked. "Renaissance," Elena replied. "If I use it, you shut everything down." "Exactly. And if at any moment you want to abort, you have that power. This is your operation, Elena. I'm just providing support." Victor stepped back, his eyes tracking over her one final time. "You look strong, confident, nothing like the woman he traded away." "Good," Elena said, surprised by how steady her voice was. "Let him see what he lost." The drive to the Carlisle Hotel took 30 minutes through midday traffic. Elena sat in the back of Victor's armored SUV, flanked by security, while her mind ran through every possible scenario. Her father would try to manipulate her. He'd play on guilt and obligation and the lifetime of conditioning that said she owed him her loyalty. But she had Victor's voice in her ear, literally through the tiny receiver hidden beneath her hair and the wire recording every word. She wasn't alone. For the first time in the confrontation with her father, she had backup. The hotel was exactly as Victor had described. Elegant, public, with enough ambient noise that private conversations felt secure even in the middle of a crowded restaurant. Victor's security team was already in place, dressed as business people and tourists, covering every exit and approach. Elena walked through the lobby with her head high, her security detail peeling off to their positions while she continued alone to the restaurant entrance. The hostess smiled professionally and led her to a table near the windows, exactly where Victor had specified. From this position, Elena could see 3/4 of the dining room, including the table where Victor sat with papers spread around him like he was conducting a business lunch. He didn't look up as she passed, but Elena felt his awareness track her every step. Richard Cross arrived exactly 7 minutes late, a calculated power move Elena recognized from a lifetime of being kept waiting. He looked the same as always. Expensive suit, silver hair perfectly styled, the confident stride of a man who'd never questioned his right to space and attention. But there was something different in his eyes when he spotted her. Something harder, more desperate. He crossed to the table and Elena forced herself to stand, to accept the brief embrace he offered, to pretend this was a normal father-daughter lunch instead of a trap closing around him. "Elena," Richard said, holding her at arm's length to examine her. "You look well. Better than I expected given the circumstances." "Hello, Daddy," Elena replied, her voice carefully neutral. They sat, and a waiter appeared immediately to take drink orders. Richard ordered scotch, expensive, specific, exactly what he always ordered. Elena asked for water, not trusting herself with anything that might dull her focus. Once the waiter disappeared, Richard leaned forward with an expression of concerned paternity that might have fooled someone who didn't know him. "I've been sick with worry. When I heard about the attack, when I thought I might have lost you." "You ordered the attack," Elena said flatly. "Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Richard's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. Then he recovered, shaking his head with what looked like genuine sadness. "Victor's poisoned you against me. I understand why you'd believe his version, given your circumstances. But Elena, I'm your father. I would never harm you." "You hit me," Elena said, touching her cheek where the bruise had long since faded. "The night you traded me to Victor, you backhanded me hard enough to leave a mark, and that was just the last in a lifetime of harm you inflicted. I was frustrated, stressed. I reacted poorly to a difficult situation." Richard's tone shifted to the reasonable, explanatory voice he'd used whenever she'd tried to confront him about his treatment. "But physical discipline and attempted murder are vastly different things. You have to see that." Elena felt Victor's presence across the room like an anchor. She took a breath and leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Then explain the men in tactical gear. Explain the $30,000 contract. Explain why they had surveillance photos of my movements on the estate. Richard's jaw tightened. Where did you get that information? Does it matter? Is it true? For a long moment, Richard just stared at her. Then he sat back, his expression shifting from concerned father to calculating businessman. You're wearing a wire. Elena's heart stopped. Across the room, she saw Victor tense almost imperceptibly. I'm not, she started. Don't lie to me, Richard interrupted, his voice cold. I've been in this business longer than Victor's been alive. I know what a setup looks like, the specific location, the insistence on this restaurant, your sudden desire to meet after weeks of silence. He smiled, and it was cruel. Did Victor think I'd be stupid enough to confess on tape? Did he think I wouldn't check you for surveillance before saying anything incriminating? Elena's mind raced. Abort the mission. Use the code word. Get out before this turned dangerous. But something in her father's arrogance triggered a different response. If he knew about the wire, he'd already calculated his next move. Running now wouldn't change anything. Yes, she said clearly. I'm wearing a wire. Victor's listening to every word, and his security team is positioned throughout this restaurant. Richard's eyebrows rose. Bold, I'll give you credit for that. The girl I raised wouldn't have had the spine for this level of deception. The girl you raised doesn't exist anymore, Elena replied. You made sure of that when you sold me to the highest bidder. I sold you to pay a debt to a dangerous man, Richard corrected. A debt that existed because I was trying to secure your future. Everything I did was to build an empire you would eventually inherit. An empire built on fraud and embezzlement, Elena said, Victor's research fresh in her mind. Shell companies in the Caymans, falsified tax returns going back 15 years, money laundering through your so-called legitimate businesses. You weren't building anything for me, Dad. You were stealing and hoping you wouldn't get caught. Richard's expression went flat. Who told you about the Cayman accounts? Victor has very thorough investigators. He's been building a case against you for months. The assassination attempt just gave him the excuse to accelerate the timeline. Then this meeting wasn't about reconciliation at all, Richard said slowly. This was about getting me to confess, getting evidence to hand to prosecutors. Elena, do you have any idea what you've done? I've stopped running from you, Elena said, and her voice was stronger than it had ever been in her father's presence. I've stopped accepting your version of who I am, and I've decided to make sure you face consequences for everything you've done. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Several diners looked over, but Victor's security team didn't move. They were waiting for his signal. You ungrateful, stupid girl, Richard hissed, leaning over the table. I gave you everything. A life of privilege you did nothing to earn. And this is how you repay me? By betraying your own father to a criminal? You gave me nothing but contempt and emotional abuse, Elena replied, standing to face him. And the only reason I'm betraying you now is because you tried to have me killed when I stopped being useful to your narrative. I should have had you eliminated years ago, Richard snarled, and there it was. The confession spoken in anger, captured perfectly by the wire. You were always a liability, dead weight I carried out of obligation to your mother's memory. Trading you to Victor was the smartest thing I ever did. Getting rid of you permanently would have been smarter. Elena felt the words hit like physical blows, but she didn't flinch. And there it is, your real feelings, recorded for posterity. Richard's face went pale as he realized what he'd just said. That recording is inadmissible. I'll claim coercion, entrapment. Claim whatever you want. Victor's voice came from directly behind Richard. Elena watched her father spin around to face the man who'd orchestrated his downfall. The recording is just insurance. The real evidence is already with federal prosecutors. Bank records, emails, testimony from your former associates who were very eager to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. You're finished, Richard. Richard looked between Victor and Elena, his expression cycling through rage, desperation, and finally settling on cold calculation. You think you've won, both of you, but I have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers who'll tie up any prosecution for years, friends in places that matter. Had resources, Victor corrected. Had friends. Past tense. Because while you were planning attacks on my estate and trying to kill your daughter, I was systematically dismantling your entire network. Your accounts are frozen. Your associates have flipped. And those friends you're counting on? They've already distanced themselves from the scandal that's about to become your legacy. Richard lunged toward Elena so fast that she didn't have time to move, but Victor's security team was faster. 3 men appeared from nowhere, intercepting Richard and forcing him back into his chair with professional efficiency. "Don't touch her," Victor said quietly, and the threat in his voice made the temperature drop. "You've lost the privilege of being in her presence, and if you're very fortunate, you'll never see her again after today." Federal agents appeared at the restaurant entrance. Victor's final contingency, Elena realized. This had been coordinated with law enforcement from the beginning. Her father was being arrested in public, in front of witnesses, with his confession recorded and his crimes documented. Richard Cross was led away in handcuffs, still protesting, still threatening, still convinced he could talk his way out of consequences the way he'd done his entire life. But this time, the law wasn't listening. Elena stood frozen at the table, watching her father disappear through the restaurant doors, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. It was over. Actually over. He couldn't hurt her anymore. Couldn't control her. Couldn't even contact her once the protective orders Victor's lawyers were filing went through. "Elena," Victor's voice was gentle. "Let's go home." She turned to him, and the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "I did it. I actually did it." "You were magnificent," Victor said, and there was genuine pride in his voice. "Stronger than I imagined, braver than he deserved." He guided her out of the restaurant, through the lobby, into the waiting SUV. And as they drove away from the Carlisle Hotel, Elena watched the building disappear in the rearview mirror and felt something she'd never experienced before. Freedom. The days following her father's arrest passed in a strange blur of legal proceedings and media frenzy. Elena watched from the safety of Victor's estate as the story exploded across every news outlet in the city. Richard Cross, once untouchable pillar of New York society, now facing federal charges for fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The details were salacious enough to dominate headlines for weeks. The daughter he'd traded to a rival, the assassination attempt, the recorded confession that made denial impossible. Victor shielded her from the worst of it, but Elena insisted on reading the reports. She needed to see it in black and white. Needed proof that her father's empire was truly crumbling, that the man who'd spent 26 years convincing her she was worthless was finally being held accountable. The prosecutor called, Victor said one morning, finding Elena in the library where she'd taken to spending most of her time. "Your father's lawyers are attempting to negotiate a plea deal. They want to avoid trial." Elena looked up from the art history textbook she'd been pretending to read. "What kind of deal?" 20 years minimum, no possibility of parole for at least 12, full restitution of stolen funds, forfeiture of all assets. Victor sat beside her, his presence steady and grounding. "It's a strong offer. The prosecutor thinks we should take it. Trials are unpredictable, and this guarantees he goes away for a significant portion of his life." "What do you think?" Elena asked. Victor studied her carefully. "I think the decision should be yours. You're the one he tried to kill. You're the one who survived his abuse. If you want to watch him face a jury, make him defend his actions publicly, we can push for trial. But if you want this over so you can move forward with your life, the plea deal accomplishes that." Elena closed her textbook, her fingers tracing the embossed cover. 20 years. Her father would be in his 70s when he got out, his empire gone, his reputation destroyed, his freedom stolen the way he'd stolen hers for so long. "I want it over," she said quietly. "I want to never think about him again. Take the deal." Victor nodded, pulling out his phone to relay her decision to his lawyers. While he made the call, Elena walked to the library windows, looking out over the gardens where she'd nearly died, and somehow found the strength to fight back. 3 weeks later, Richard Cross stood in federal court and pled guilty to 14 separate charges. Elena watched via closed-circuit television from Victor's study, refusing to give her father the satisfaction of seeing her in person. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in his prison jumpsuit, the arrogance finally stripped away by the weight of consequences he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. When the judge pronounced sentence, 22 years in federal prison, Elena felt something crack open in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, something deeper. The final severing of chains she'd worn so long she'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Victor stood behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. "How do you feel?" "Empty," Elena admitted. "Like there should be more. Relief or happiness or something. But I just feel empty." "That's normal," Victor said quietly. "You've spent your entire life defined by his cruelty and your survival of it. Now that the threat is gone, you have to figure out who you are without that defining struggle. It's disorienting." Elena turned to face him, and the understanding in his eyes nearly undid her. "What if I don't know how to do that? Be someone without him as the villain in my story?" "Then we figure it out together," Victor replied. "Starting with this." Right. He handed her a legal document, and Elena's hands trembled as she read the title. Dissolution of Contract. The agreement her father had signed, trading her to Victor, formally voided and nullified. "You're free," Victor said. "Legally, officially, completely. No ownership, no obligation. You can leave this estate whenever you want, go wherever you want, build whatever life you want. I won't stop you." The words should have filled her with joy. Instead, Elena felt panic claw up her throat. "You want me to leave?" "No," Victor said, and the honesty in his voice was devastating. "I want you to stay, but I want you to stay because you choose it, not because some contract binds you here. I want you to wake up every morning and decide that this is where you belong, with me, in this life we're building. But that choice has to be yours, Elena, freely made, or it means nothing." Elena stared at the dissolution papers, at the legal language that erased every chain her father had placed on her, and realized she was terrified. Not of Victor, not of this life, but of the responsibility of choosing it, of admitting that she'd fallen in love with the man who'd bought her, that she'd found home in what started as captivity. "I don't know how to make this choice," she whispered. "Everything I've ever done has been dictated by someone else. My father. You. The contracts and rules and expectations. How do I know what I actually want versus what I've been conditioned to accept?" Victor pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face with devastating gentleness. "Then don't decide today. Take time. The contract is dissolved regardless. Whether you stay or go, you're free. But Elena, I need you to hear this. I didn't fall for the broken girl your father traded away. I fell for the woman who survived him and became stronger. The one who faced down assassins and federal operations without breaking. The one who's brave enough to ask hard questions even when she's terrified of the answers." "You fell for me?" Elena's voice cracked on the words. "Completely, catastrophically, in ways that violate every rule I've lived by about keeping distance from complications." Victor's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "I told myself you were an asset, a tool to punish your father, but somewhere between watching you adapt to this world and seeing you flourish under protection instead of abuse, you became something infinitely more valuable. You became essential." Elena kissed him, not tentatively or questioningly, but with all the certainty she'd been claiming she didn't possess. Victor responded immediately, one hand sliding into her hair while the other pulled her closer, the kiss deepening into something that felt like promises neither of them had words for. When they finally broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against his, breathing hard. "I'm staying, not because of the contract, not because I'm afraid of the world outside these walls, but because you see me, actually see me. And I don't want to be anywhere you aren't." "You're sure?" Victor asked. "This life isn't easy, Elena. My world is dangerous. There will always be threats, always be enemies. I can protect you, but I can't guarantee safety." "I don't want guarantees," Elena replied. "I want choice, and I choose this. I choose you. I choose the life where I get to be strong instead of small." Victor kissed her again, slower this time, savoring instead of claiming. When he pulled back, his expression was softer than she'd ever seen it. "Then we do this properly," he said. "No contracts, no ownership, just two people building something real together." The following months unfolded with a rhythm Elena had never imagined possible. She started classes at Columbia in the fall, escorted by security, but otherwise free to navigate campus and engage with her education on her own terms. The other students knew who she was, the daughter of the disgraced Richard Cross, now living with Victor Hale, but Victor's reputation was apparently fearsome enough that no one dared approach her with anything less than respect. She excelled in her courses, finding that without her father's constant criticism, she actually enjoyed learning. Art history became a passion rather than an escape. She wrote papers that earned praise from professors. She participated in class discussions without the crushing anxiety that she'd say something stupid. At home, the estate transformed from a fortress into something that felt genuinely lived in. Victor still worked long hours managing his empire, but he made time for dinner with Elena every night. They talked about her classes, his business ventures, the legitimate investments he'd been developing to eventually transition away from the criminal enterprises that had built his wealth. "I want to go legal," Victor admitted one night over wine in the library. "Not because of guilt or pressure, but because I'm tired of always watching my back. And because I want to build something that won't put you at risk." Elena set down her glass. "You don't have to change your entire life for me." "I'm not changing for you," Victor corrected. "I'm changing because you made me realize I could want more than power and fear. You made me want a future that doesn't end with enemies or prison." It was the most vulnerable she'd ever seen him, and Elena crossed to where he sat, settling into his lap with easy familiarity. "Then we'll build that future together, legal empire and all." Victor's arms wrapped around her waist. "Mrs. Chen thinks we should get married." Elena froze. "What?" "She pointed out that you living here without any legal protections makes you vulnerable if something happens to me. And that if we're building a future together, we should formalize it properly." Victor's expression was carefully neutral. "I told her it was too soon, that we needed more time to be certain. But Elena, I've been certain since you stood in that restaurant and faced down your father without flinching. I just didn't know if you were ready to hear it." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm telling you that when you're ready, I'd like to ask properly. With a ring and a proposal that isn't tangled up in contracts or ownership. Just me asking if you want to build a life together, officially, legally, as equals." Elena kissed him instead of answering with words, pouring everything she felt into the contact. When she finally pulled back, Victor was smiling, a genuine, unguarded expression she'd learned was reserved only for her. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That's a not yet, but ask me again in 6 months," Elena replied. "I want to be sure I'm choosing this from a place of strength, not just gratitude or trauma bonding, or any of the other psychological explanations for why captives fall for their captors." "Fair," Victor said. "But Elena, this stopped being captivity the moment you had real choices. What we have now, that's built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Don't let clinical terms diminish what's real between us." 6 months later, Victor proposed on the anniversary of the day Elena had first walked into his estate. He took her back to the garden where she'd nearly died, but now the space was transformed. The fountain repaired, new flowers blooming, the scars of violence erased by time and intentional healing. He got down on one knee with a ring that was elegant rather than ostentatious, perfect for her taste, and asked if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. Not his property, not his asset, his equal partner in building a life neither of them had imagined possible. Elena said yes without hesitation, and they were married 3 months later in a small ceremony on the estate grounds. Mrs. Chen cried. Victor's security team stood as unofficial groomsmen, and Elena wore a dress she'd chosen herself, in a style that flattered rather than hid her body, feeling beautiful for the first time in her life. Her father sent a letter from prison. Elena burned it without reading it. Whatever Richard Cross had to say no longer mattered. He'd lost the right to her attention when he'd chosen cruelty over love, ownership over relationship. 2 years after their wedding, Elena graduated from Columbia with honors. Victor attended the ceremony, sitting in the audience with pride written across his face as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma. She'd done it. Finished something she'd started. Proved to herself that she was capable of more than surviving. She took a position at a major museum, curating Renaissance art collections, using the knowledge she'd gained to build a career on her own terms. Victor supported her completely, never once suggesting she should stay home or limit her ambitions. He'd meant what he said about wanting an equal partner, and he proved it every day by encouraging her independence while remaining the steady foundation she could always return to. 3 years into their marriage, Elena found out she was pregnant. The news terrified her. She had no model for good parenting, only her father's catastrophic example. But Victor held her while she cried and promised that they would figure it out together, that their child would grow up knowing they were valued, wanted, loved unconditionally. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, perfect and tiny and screaming with the kind of healthy fury that made Elena laugh through her tears. They named her Sophia, and Elena held her in the hospital room while Victor sat beside them, his hand gentle on Sophia's small head. "She's going to have everything we didn't," Victor said quietly. "Security that comes from love, not fear. Parents who see her potential instead of her flaws. A life where she chooses her own path." Elena looked at her husband and their daughter and felt something she'd spent 26 years believing was impossible. Complete, unqualified happiness. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of people who made problems bearable. A family built on choice and respect rather than obligation and control. 5 years later, Victor's legitimate business empire had completely replaced his criminal enterprises. He sat on boards of major corporations, invested in technology startups, donated to causes that actually help people instead of just burnishing his image. The transformation wasn't easy, and there were still enemies from his old life who occasionally caused problems. But he'd built enough legal power and political connections that those threats were manageable. Elena had become the museum's youngest curator of Renaissance art, her exhibitions drawing international attention. She published papers. She traveled for research, always with security, but increasingly comfortable navigating the world on her own terms. And she came home to Victor and Sophia every night, to the estate that had started as a prison and become a sanctuary. One evening, Sophia safely asleep upstairs, Elena and Victor sat in the library where so much of their story had unfolded. Elena was curled against his side, reading exhibition proposals, while Victor reviewed acquisition opportunities for his investment portfolio. "Do you ever think about how we started?" Elena asked suddenly. Victor set aside his papers. "Frequently. Why?" "Because I was thinking about how wrong everyone would say this is. Stockholm Syndrome, power imbalance, all the clinical terms for why we shouldn't work." Elena looked up at him. "But we do work. Against all odds and psychological predictions. We're actually happy." "We work because we chose to," Victor replied. "You could have left the moment that contract was dissolved. I gave you every opportunity, but you stayed because you wanted this life, not because you were trapped in it." "I stayed because you saw me when everyone else looked away," Elena corrected. "Because you believed I could be more than my father's discarded liability. Because you gave me space to become strong instead of trying to keep me weak." Victor pulled her closer, his lips brushing her temple. "You were always strong, Elena. You just needed someone to stop punishing you for it." Elena thought about the terrified woman who'd stood in her father's penthouse, listening to him negotiate her price. The girl who'd believed she was worthless because the people who should have loved her treated her as disposable. That version of herself felt like a different person now. Someone she had compassion for but no longer recognized as her complete identity. "I want to do something," Elena said. "Use my experience to help other women in similar situations. Domestic abuse survivors, women who've been trafficked or sold or trapped in arrangements they didn't choose." Victor was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. "That's a powerful idea. Also potentially dangerous, depending on how public you make it." "I know, but I have resources now, your protection. My own platform. It feels wrong to have survived what I survived and not use it to help others escape." Elena sat up, facing him fully. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. But I want your support." Victor smiled, and it was proud and fierce. "You have it. Completely. Whatever you need, funding, security, connections, it's yours. Build something that matters, Elena. Show the world what survivors can become when they're given real support." The foundation launched 2 years later. Elena named it Renaissance, for new beginnings and the art history that had been her escape during the darkest times. It provided housing, legal services, education, and job training for women escaping abusive situations. Victor funded it generously, but Elena ran it with the same fierce competence she'd brought to every aspect of her rebuilt life. She spoke at conferences, sharing her story, but never positioning herself as a victim. She was a survivor, a woman who'd been traded like property and decided that experience would define her strength rather than her limitations. And she helped hundreds of other women find their own strength, their own paths to freedom. On the 10th anniversary of the day Richard Cross had sold her to Victor Hale, Elena stood in the library where she'd first started to believe she could be more than her father's disappointment. Sophia was 8 now, brilliant and confident, and completely unaware that her mother's life had once been measured in ownership and contracts. She knew only that her parents loved her, that she was safe, that she could become anything she wanted. Victor found Elena by the windows, looking out at gardens that had witnessed her near death and her rebirth. "Thinking about him?" Victor asked quietly. Elena shook her head. "Not really. Just thinking about how different my life could have been. If you'd been cruel, if I'd been too broken to heal, if I'd let fear win instead of finding courage, I didn't know I had." "You would have found your way eventually," Victor said, "with or without me. That strength was always in you." "Maybe," Elena allowed, "but I'm glad it was with you. Glad you were the one who saw potential instead of problems. Glad we built this life together." Victor wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Richard wrote again. The lawyers forwarded the letter. Elena stiffened slightly. Her father had been writing periodically for years, letters she never read, attempts at reconciliation or manipulation she refused to engage with. He was scheduled for release in 8 more years, his health failing, his empire long since dissolved and distributed to his victims. "Burn it," she said. "Already did," Victor replied. "But I wanted you to know it came, in case you ever wanted to respond." Elena turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd bought her and somehow given her everything her father never had: love, respect, the space to become whoever she wanted to be. "I have nothing to say to him," Elena said firmly. "He stopped being relevant to my story the moment I chose you over his manipulation. He's just a cautionary tale now, a reminder of what happens when you treat people as disposable." "Good," Victor said, "because you, Elena Hale, are anything but disposable. You're essential. To me, to our daughter, to every woman your foundation helps escape the kind of life you survived." Elena kissed him, deep and certain, tasting a decade of shared history and countless tomorrows still to come. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, breathing in the expensive cologne that had become synonymous with safety and home. "I love you," she said, "for seeing me, for protecting me, for giving me the space to become strong." "I love you for surviving," Victor replied, "for choosing strength over surrender, for building a life that proves your father was catastrophically wrong about your worth." That night, Elena fell asleep in Victor's arms, in the fortress that had started as her prison and become her kingdom. She dreamed of Renaissance art and new beginnings, of Sophia's laughter, and the women she'd helped escape their own fathers and contracts and prisons. She dreamed of freedom that tasted like choice. And when she woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through windows that no longer felt like barriers, Elena Cross, now Elena Hale, smiled at the life she'd built from the ashes of her father's worst betrayal. She'd been sold as punishment and become a queen in her own right. She'd been treated as worthless and proven her immeasurable value. She'd been broken by cruelty and rebuilt through respect. The girl her father traded away was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who'd claimed her power, who'd transformed captivity into partnership and survival into triumph. Elena's story didn't end with rescue. It ended with choice, with love freely given and accepted, with a daughter who would never know what it felt like to be invisible, with a foundation that helped other women rewrite their own narratives. It ended, finally and completely, with Elena standing in the morning light of her chosen life, unbroken and untouchable, exactly as she'd always deserved to be.